They handed him an old rifle and smiled, politely assuming he'd miss, and he did. Once the young instructor whispered, "Let's not waste too much ammo." But on his second shot, the range went silent. Noon knew who he was until the base commander stepped forward and said, "That man still holds our longest-standing record, stands as a testament to the belief that true skill never fades. If you believe some veterans still have stories worth hearing, hit subscribe and stay with us. This one's something special." The morning air was crisp over Fort Ashton, a modest military base on the edge of town. Most days were calm, but today, the firing range was alive with activity. New recruits were lined up, helmets, slightly tilted rifles gleaming with fresh oil. They were here for one thing, the quarterly marksmanship test off to the side. A rusted Ford pickup rolled up the gravel path. The driver's side opened slowly, and an elderly man stepped out. His name was Edward Dawson. Though most just called him Eddie, he wore an old windbreaker over a faded flannel, and his left boot had a slight limp in it. A cloth bag hung from his shoulder. Not military issue, just canvas, and where his grandson, Private Jesse Dawson, jogged over from the line. "Grandpa, you made it," he whispered, eyes bright. Eddie gave a small smile. "Wouldn't miss it," Jesse thought. "I'd watch you boys show off." One of the younger recruits looked over. "Hey, who's the old guy?" Jesse turned. "My grandfather, he used to shoot back when." But the boy was already looking away. The instructors barely noticed Eddie. At first, one of them, Sergeant Kramer, finally approached. With a plastic chair, "You're welcome to watch, sir," he said politely. "Just maybe stay back behind the line, it gets loud." Eddie nodded. Of course. But just before he sat, he opened his canvas bag. Inside was something wrapped in cloth. A long, aged rifle, polished but clearly used. He ran, his hand along the barrel like he was greeting an old friend. No one noticed. Not yet. Sergeant Kramer gave a short laugh when he saw the old rifle in Eddie's hands. "Didn't think folks still used woodstock rifles like that?" he said, chuckling. "Might be better off hanging that in a museum, sir." Eddie just nodded. "She still works long as my hands cooperate." Jesse shifted uncomfortably. "He used to shoot back in the day pretty good too, right?" Kramer said, scanning the line. "Well, we've got a spare target down at lane 9 if he wants to take a couple shots just for fun." The word fun hung in the air like a joke. No one laughed at Eddie. Stepped up to lane 9 slower than the others. He adjusted his glasses, then squared his shoulders. The best he could. His left knee trembled slightly. A few of their recruits near him tried not to stare. One whispered, "Bet he can't even keep the barrel steady." Another snickered, "Might want to call range control for a medic." Eddie heard none of it, or maybe he just chose not to. He raised the rifle, closed one eye, and took a deep breath. Then bang, the bullet missed clean. There was a pause, then a few muffled chuckles. Kramer clapped his hands. "Okay, let's not waste too much ammo now." But Eddie's voice cut in calm and quiet. "One more." Kramer turned back, eyebrows raised. "Sir, maybe it's best if I said." Eddie repeated, leveling his gaze. "One more." His tone wasn't loud, but something about it made everyone pause. Jesse stepped forward. "He's got this." Sergeant Kramer glanced at the other instructors, then nodded. "All right, one more." Eddie took a second to steady himself. This time he didn't rush. He ran his thumb across the stock like he was remembering something. Then he adjusted his grip, slow and precise. The wind eased. The others kept talking behind him, but Eddie heard none of it, just the rhythm of breath in, out, focus. She raised the rifle again, not trembling. Now just still. A calm sort of still. His finger curled over the trigger. Then bang, and this time the sound that followed was silence. The shot echoed down the length of the range, slicing through the still air like a whisper with weight. At first no one said anything. Then someone from the back mumbled, "Was that a hit?" Sergeant Kramer squinted down the scope. He didn't move, his jaw tensed. He turned, the knob slowly zooming in further as far as it would go. Then he leaned back and stepped away from the scope. His face had gone pale. Private Jesse, nervous, now looked up. Sarge Kramer didn't answer him. He just gestured silently for another instructor to take a look. One by one, the instructors passed the spotting scope around. No one laughed this time. No smirks, no side comments. Finally, one of the younger recruits walked forward and lifted his binoculars. No way. A laminated silhouette target flapped lightly in the breeze. At the far end of the range, the bullseye had been split clean through the center. A tear so exact it looked like a knife had pierced it edge to edge. One shot, dead center, perfect. Eddie stood quietly. At the line, lowering his rifle like he just finished pouring a cup of coffee. His face didn't gloat. No smile, no smugness. He simply turned to Jesse and said, "That'll do." The recruit with the binoculars muttered. He didn't even brace. "I didn't think he could even lift that rifle right," another added, eyes wide. Jesse grinned, pride welling in his chest. "He doesn't need to brace. He built that stance back in '68. Another recruit leaned over, whispering, "Wait, what did he say his name was?" Just then, Sergeant Kramer cleared his throat. Edward Dawson's suddenly Thessalons got heavier. Not awkward, just respectful voice from the back said, "You don't think that's Eddie Dawson from Fort Bragg?" Kramer didn't answer, because deep down he already knew. A soldier jogged off toward the main office without being asked. Within moments, the base's old personnel logs were being pulled from a computer system that hadn't been touched in years. As for Eddie, he'd already sat down again, carefully setting the rifle back in its canvas sleeve, not to hide it. Just Torres. They looked over at Jesse and gave a nod like a man who'd finished something not for himself, but for someone else to witness, and the others, they just stood there staring at the torn bullseye like it meant something more than a shot, because in that moment it did. The name Edward Dawson moved like a quiet wave through the crowd. Some shrugged unfamiliar, but one of the older range officers, Master Sergeant Clayton Graying at the temples and half-retired himself, froze mid-step. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "Dawson, Fort Bragg. 83. Right?" Kramer nodded. "He said he shot there." "Yeah, why?" Clayton didn't answer. Instead, he walked straight to the control building. At the edge of the field inside the office was cramped with old binders, dusty plaques, and a slow-loading computer. From 2 decades ago, he typed, slowly, one key at a time. "Dawson Edward search match found." He clicked, and there it was, an archived entry with a photo scanned from paper. A younger man, lean and sunburned, standing beside a paper target, split exactly through the center. Fort Bragg marksmanship record. 83. Longest standing bullseye shot in open range conditions. Unbroken. Clayton blinked the timestamp on. The record read July 12, 1983, exactly 40 years ago this week. He walked out slowly, holding a printout in his hand, like it weighed 10 lb by the time. He got back. A black SUV had pulled into the gravel lot, the kind with government plates and a flag decal from it. Stepped Colonel Daniel Whitmore, the base commander. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked the length of the range until he stood in front of the seated old man. Eddie didn't stand. He just looked up. "Colonel." Whitmore removed his shatzir. He said quietly, "We keep a plaque inside. It's been hanging above the range office for 40 years. Your name's on it. Some of us read it once a year, but most never knew the man behind it was still alive." Eddie gave a soft nod. "Didn't come here for applause, I know," Whitmore replied, "but that shot today, it wasn't luck, it was legacy." The recruit stood a little straighter now. The instructor stepped back respectfully, and Jesse, he looked at his grandfather with a different kind of pride, the kind that comes when you realize your family name means something far beyond what you knew. Eddie placed a hand on Jesse's shoulder. "I trained a lot of soldiers once, thought maybe it was time to come watch one later." That afternoon, as the sun settled, behind the trees, a few of the younger soldiers gathered in the lounge. Word had already spread around the base. A retired marksman had returned, and still hadn't missed. Inside the control office, Jesse sat beside his grandfather, holding the old rifle across his knees. "You never told me," he said softly. Eddie looked out the window. Wasn't much to tell. Jesse shook his head. "You've had a base record for 40 years, trained half the guys in sniper school. They said you were one of the best to ever walk through Fort Bragg." Eddie gave a quiet shrug. "Records fade, medals get boxed up. What matters is who you show up for when no one's looking." Jesse opened Eddie's canvas bag again, digging past the cleaning cloth and old earplugs. Beneath it all was a worn leather folder. Inside, newspaper clippings, a faded certificate, and a photograph. It showed a young Eddie Dawson kneeling beside 2 soldiers, one of them a young lieutenant named Parker, the other a man in a wheelchair smiling. With half a salute, the headline read, "Army sharpshooter pulls 3 from ambush refuses medal." "I found this online a few years ago," Jesse admitted, eyes on the worn photo. "But I didn't know it was you." Eddie leaned in, gently tracing the photo's edge with his thumb. "Those boys didn't make it home," he said quietly. The only reason that article ever got written was because Parker held on just long enough to tell the story. Jesse studied him for a moment. Why'd you stop shooting? Eddie was silent for a long time before replying. Because after that day, it didn't feel like a skill anymore. It felt like a burden. So I stepped back. I trained others, stayed behind the line, and let the young ones take the lead. Jesse didn't say a word. He just gave a slow, solemn nod, the kind that says, I hear you. I see you, I won't forget. Outside, a few of the recruits stood in a quiet line near the entrance knot for training to shake his hand one by one. They came through not with fanfare, just gratitude. No one asked for stories, they just said, thank you, sir. And Eddie nodded in return. He never told them about the ambush or the night missions or the medals that never arrived. He just sat there with a quiet grace that said, I was never here to be remembered, I just didn't want to be forgotten. The next morning, the shooting range was quiet. No scheduled drills, no shouted commands, just the steady hum of wind moving through the trees. Eddie arrived early. Not because he was asked, but because it felt like the right thing to. Dewey carried nothing but a thermos of coffee, and his cap tucked under his arm. At the far end of the range, Jesse stood. Waiting behind him were 4 recruits. The same ones who had chuckled just 2 days before. Now they held fresh targets under their arms and looked nervous. Not because they feared getting yelled at, but because they didn't want to disappoint Private Dawson. Eddie called these boys any good. Jesse smiled better than they were. Still got room to learn. Eddie nodded. Good, you keep him steady. I stayed back that morning. Didn't touch Arifel. Didn't give a speech, but every so often Jesse would glance over just to make sure he was still watching. And Eddie always was. Later, as the recruits packed up, Sergeant Kramer approached. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I thought you were just someone tagging along. Didn't know I was standing in front of the reason half-hour training manuals even exist. Eddie shook his hand. We all start somewhere. Sergeant, what matters is how we finish. Kramer nodded. Your shot, we framed at the target. It's going in the main office, next to the 1983 plaque. Eddie raised an eyebrow. Still had that plaque, huh? Kramer smiled. We do now. Before he left, Jesse caught up to him. They're going to talk about you now. The others, you'll be remembered. Eddie sipped from his thermos, then looked over the quiet field. I'm not worried about being remembered, he said. I'm just glad someone else knows the story now. He pulled the old cap over his head and walked back to the truck, and Jesse stood there a few seconds longer watching him go. Because sometimes legacies don't need statues or speeches. Sometimes all it takes is one good shot and someone willing to watch. It happened 3 days later. A new frame appeared on the wall inside the range's main office. It hung beside an old plaqueon that had gathered dust for decades. Inside the frame was the target from Eddie Dawson's second shot, still split, still clean below it. A small brass plate read Edward Dawson Fort. Bragg, 1983, returned in 2023. Still precise, still humble. Most people who walked past never noticed it at first, but the ones who knew, they paused in the corner of the office. Our retired Marine leaned in close and whispered, he missed once. Then reminded us all what discipline really looks like. Outside, Jesse found his grandfather sitting alone on the bench. Beneath the old flagpole, a gentle breeze moved through the leaves above them. Eddie's cane rested at his side, untouched in his hands. He held nothing but a folded paper napkin and a fresh cup of black coffee. You come to fire again? Fire? Jesse asked. Eddie shook his head. No, just came to hear it. To hear what? He tilted his head toward the field where another group of recruits was lining up at the range, the sound of it all carrying on. They sat together for a while, neither saying much, because some stories don't need telling twice, and some legacies don't need volume, just silence, respect, and a bullet that found its mark even after 20 years. If someone in your life ever showed quiet strength, share this story with them, and if you believe